Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? You know, I'd really love to take the credit for all these brilliant ideas I come up with here. Well, maybe they're not so brilliant, but you know, a lot of times what you see is a synthesis of ideas after I've been talking to quite a few people. So I really can't take credit for or take the blame for you know, what finally comes out as a synthesis. Maybe I can take the blame, but I can't take the credit for coming up with a lot of this stuff. You know, these are my experiences, their experiences, and shared perspectives. So we've been having this really engaging conversation about players taking responsibility for learning the game and what have you, about system mastery and a lot of different levels. And we've been coming at it from a lot of different angles. So you know, one of the things that that Jim, the FNG, came up with the other day as an analogy is, you know, learning a game system is kind of like going to the optometrist. You find out, you know, where your deficits are. You get a new pair of glasses, and all of a sudden you can look at the text, and it becomes, to mix visual metaphors, becomes less opaque. It becomes sharply in focus, and you realize like how your character works, how the system works, and so you're better able to make decisions to interface with the game. You know, it makes a lot of sense. Complex Games Apologist was talking, you know, at length about this, and the idea, this is something I've done for a long time, and I think a lot of us have done, is where you start to imagine playing your character, or, you know, probably more frequently, you know, for a lot of us game masters, you start to imagine running the game as a game master. You start to imagine scenarios, but you don't just imagine it in terms of the fiction or in terms of your character concept, but you imagine it in terms of, you know, how this game actually works. You look at the stats, and I'm not just talking about, you know, looking at the stats on your character sheet, but how do these mechanics actually work? You start to envision certain scenarios and like, how would I react to that? And you know, it could be just the classic thing as a game master, it's looking at saying, well, I wonder how, if these monsters are going to trounce the party. Maybe you actually run some mock combats. You know, that's a very, you know, common way to do something like that. But often, you know, as a player looking at your character, it could be something as simple and as classic as looking at your spell list, figuring out what they are and wondering what would I do with these, or what could I do with these in these certain situations. Or it could be a whole bunch of other stuff. But you know, the idea that like often you can learn your character and be less infected with the analysis or paralysis of analysis in the moment, if I can say that. Tongue twister. Because you already know how this works. You're not stuck flipping through things. Well, what can I do here? What, you know, what am I allowed to do? All that sort of thing. Or, you know, where am I going to bump you know, heads with the system? Where's the system going to push back on me? All that stuff. If you understand your options beforehand, it's a lot easier. You know, Eloy talked about that common idea that a lot of games, especially if they're more complicated, are a bit front-loaded. And they're front-loaded in terms of you need to learn all this stuff before you actually play. So the big, steep part of the learning curve is in the front. Also, the idea that you can learn your character in a more front-loaded manner. And he gave us this example of, he said, no exaggeration, it was something like 7 or 8 hours actually crunching the numbers for a Shadowrun character. And he's got an internal video with us where he's flipping pages in this notebook saying, well, here's all my list, you know, stats for this and this and this. The benefit of doing that was, come game time, he didn't have to do any calculations at all. He knew what his character was capable of, he knew what his chances were, and every once in a while he had to apply a situational modifier, but that was about it. He wasn't stuck in the moment wondering, you know, how do I do this, what can I do, all that stuff. You know, so that's a real frequent or commonplace type of work, and sometimes we neglect to do that. And then we show up at the table and all of a sudden you're wondering, well, how do I do this? Or, you know, what does the game system say here? So we take that time to, like, you know, put in our, you know, go see the optometrist, go check this out and see how it really works. Here's where, as we were talking, it started to, I don't want to say fall apart for me, but become more difficult for me. And this is, warning, you know, tinged with a lot of preference and bias. And it's funny because Eloy and I were kind of coming from the same angle, preference and bias-wise. And this is in terms of games that contain a lot of meta considerations. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying in terms of pre-imagining, you know, learning the system, you know, before actually using it. And it's very easy to pre-imagine, you know, what my character would do. I can look at somebody like Zachary Bishop in our Mythos Mithras game, and I can see, based on the system, I can imagine, like, you know, his actions. And I can look at somebody else like Joe Decker in our Hollow Earth Expedition game, completely different. They, in some ways, they're somewhat similar characters on the surface level. However, the system informs, you know, how I play them, and it informs, like, you know, how I imagine them doing things, because I know different things happen. And if I was playing somebody in an OSR, it'd be a completely different, experience. However, it's more difficult for me to imagine somebody like Kaitek Asimov in our Star Trek Adventures game. I can imagine what he can do a little bit in terms of his abilities, but there are a lot of meta considerations in terms of what do you do with momentum. And so as I'm imagining, his capabilities in a particular scene, it becomes a little bit more difficult because it's harder to imagine, well, what would I do with this much momentum? What would I spend my momentum on? Would I take threat here? And these start to be concerns about, affecting the fiction outside of the character himself. It could, even be, other things like games like Fate or, some Powered by the Apocalypse games, where some of these decisions you're making, they're not really about the character, about the abilities of the character. They're about constructing or stepping into the writer's room. And that's a little bit more difficult for me. Eloy made this great analogy of at some point when you're playing a game like that. I'm not knocking them. I told you this is tinged with some preference and bias. There's that moment where it's like the end of the Matrix, where all of a sudden, Neo no longer sees the illusion. He sees all the lines of code, all the little green numbers are, zipping down the screen. And that's what sort of happens to me, in a moment like that. That really rang true with me when Eloy said that. As we're looking at and considering all these meta concerns, how we're going to shape and affect game world reality outside of our character, something where we're no longer having this experience as the character. And it's tougher for me to pre-imagine, to prepare for those eventualities, because it really has nothing to do with my character. It has to do with collaboratively creating a story, which, if that's your intent, that's great, and I'm not knocking it. But for me, sometimes it's more difficult to imagine and prepare for that, I guess is my point. I have a similar experience where the lines of code start to appear when I'm playing a game that's highly tactical, and that's all we're doing. But that's a different story, and once again, that's tinged with bias and preference. But at the end of the day, it is extraordinarily useful to spend the time, look at the system, learn it, but then have those thought experiments, have those moments where you step into, what would I do here? Imagine various situations with the character or with the scenarios as a game master, and figure out what you do with the mechanics. I'm sure for some people it's easy and productive to imagine those more meta concerns. For me, it's a little bit more difficult because at some point it starts to make less sense to me, and I start to be more and more divorced from the character and from the fiction, from the experience that I'm looking for. Once again, a little bias and preference. So it's kind of a rambly video. I'm not really sure if it had a point or if it went off in too many different directions, but it's something I've been thinking about. And as these various discussions kind of intersected each other, it raised my eyebrow a little bit. So that's my thought for the day. The end.